Americans who grew up in the 90s, how does the country's spirit feel now compared to then? There genuinely was a feeling that everything was going to be all right. The economy was booming. Housing was cheap. Things were looking up and seemed like they would only get better. The collapse of the bubble, followed immediately by 9/11, changed everything. It genuinely felt like the future I had in front of me was destroyed and replaced with something much less hopeful. 90s were a brief period between the end of the Cold War and the start of the war on terror. It was also the most economic growth due to internet. Us run a budget surplus, the only time in living memory. Most college graduates and some high school graduates were sucked into the internet economy. Young people had money. Early 90s did have a lot of crime and riots. Famously, Reed was 92. New York annual murder rate peaked at 3 in 92. It wasn't associated with 90s due to it was a trend continued from the 80s. Crime started to fall in mid-90s. I miss when the big political controversy was whether the presidential candidate smoked weed. Edit. Spelling. Back in the 90s, there was this element of let's do something weird and new just because. As opposed to now, let's do something weird and new and see if we can monetize it. In fact, there was a strong idea of selling out was shameful. Deeply so. Of course, this wasn't for all things. If you were a pop star, it was understood you were going to shill some. No one frowned on that. That is something pop stars did. But there was also the idea of keeping genuine things genuine. Grassroots things were supposed to stay grassroots, not sell out to large corporations the moment money was flash. But that idea started going out the window by the very late 90s, and by 2001, it was gone. Well, I was a teen in the 90s, but you have to also remember that news was much more localized. So if there were major stories in other places, you'd hear about them. But for the most part, you really only knew what was happening near you. Also, without the internet, people weren't able to find people to agree with any random fucked-up view they had. Flat earthers, for example, didn't have groups to go to enable their stupid opinions. Everyone didn't have a camera on them at all times to record any perceived wrong. So, because of all that things felt a lot better. I'm sure it's also the fact that I was a kid who had not many worries in mind. My parents had stable jobs, so while we weren't rich, we were never worried about where our next meal would come from or anything. People were jaded, in a way, but nothing like today. Just felt better. Also, you could just like people for who they were. You rarely knew people's beliefs unless you were really good friends, even religion. Yeah, there were a few super religious people I know, but most people weren't as in your face with their faith or lack of faith as they are now. It was just much easier to get along with everyone. The 90s offered a lot of carefree optimism and imagination as to what could be. It also felt a lot more personable in terms of how we chose to communicate with people and how we recorded memories. It wasn't all good, though. I saw growing up how gents slowly realized they would never have a life equitable to their parents. I saw the emergence of corporatism and precursors of middle-class strife and how elusive the American dream was. The difference is that today we can easily talk ourselves into freak-out mode due to the shit we see on our phones. Today feels like you are throwing job applications into either a giant dark cavern or a huge, messy application pile, being quickly sifted through by a robot. I have heard Americans who lived back then talk about a sense of optimism in the air. What did this feel like to you when you were growing up in that era, and has it completely changed by now?